Well, good morning, everybody. It's a tremendous pleasure to be with you here this morning, and also to be discussing what I think is a spiritually very fruitful, but also, as we know, perennially controversial topic of the relation between faith and reason. And the title of my talk is Faith and Reason, Classical Marriage, Modern Divorce, Catholic Indissolubility. And I just want to start by mentioning that I think the way I crafted that title, I realized afterwards it looks like it might be a talk about marriage, but actually I'm just using that as a background reference point and as a metaphor for looking at the issue of faith and reason. So that's the primary thing that I'll be speaking about. Now, as Catholics, we believe that faith and reason are harmonious. Furthermore, we believe that each is given to us by God as an essential component of a fully realized human life. As Pope St. John Paul II put it in his encyclical letter, Fides et Ratio, faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And in his recent email, Dr. Millay shared with us the words of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI regarding the patron of this guild, St. Thomas Aquinas, whose writings showed that what seemed to be reason incompatible with faith was not reason, and what seemed to be faith was not faith insofar as it was opposed to true rationality. So this is what we believe as Catholics and what each of us strives to live in our various spheres of action and responsibility. But as you all know, ours is a time when the growing chorus of voices in the media, the government, education, and the various professions, including medicine, not only disagree with us on matters of fundamental principle, but actually consider some of our most cherished convictions to be so unreasonable that they demonstrate fewer and fewer compunctions about forcing us to violate these principles as a price for membership in modern society. So there's a definite battleground in this apparent conflict between faith and reason, even if we know that in truth they are harmonious. So what are we to do? Having been invited to speak on faith and reason this morning, I am painfully aware of my own incapacity to do justice to this problem. But several things give me courage to proceed. First, there are the riches to be found in the writings of those philosophers, saints, theologians, and popes who have paved the way for us in this endeavor, a few of whom I'll be citing, and some of whose words you will find in the handout. Hopefully everybody has a handout in front of them, has some of the quotations that I'll be referring to. In fact, as we begin to climb this mountain, I feel like the man in the cartoon, which is also in the handout there. It was even more dangerous before the escalator. So it's still dangerous, but we have some great assistance. The second thing that gives me courage is being in the presence of this wonderful group of men and women who are committed to recognizing the value of the God-given gifts of human reason and divine revelation, and utilizing those gifts harmoniously in medicine and in other vital areas of life. It's an honor and inspiration for me to be with you today. And last but not least, I take courage from the promises of Christ, who has offered to sweeten our yoke and lighten our burden with the help of his grace. And before we tackle this problem, I'd like to begin with a prayer composed by St. Thomas Aquinas, with which he frequently invoked the guidance and the blessing of God in his own work. You'll find that as well at the bottom of the first page in the handout. So let's pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O infinite Creator, who in the riches of thy wisdom appointed three hierarchies of angels, and set them in wondrous order above the fiery heavens, and who apportioned the elements of the world most wisely. Do thou, who art in truth the fountain of light and wisdom, deign to shed upon the darkness of my understanding the rays of thy infinite brightness, and remove far from me the twofold darkness into which I was born, namely sin and ignorance. Do thou, who givest speech to the tongues of little children, instruct my tongue, and pour into my lips the grace of thy blessing. Give me keenness of mind, capacity for remembering, method and ease in learning, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant eloquence in speech. Instruct the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to completion. thou who art true God and true man, who live and reign, world without end.
Amen.
Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So the first part of my talk is entitled The Modern Challenge, Faith and Reason Estranged. Let's begin by looking at the nature of the challenge we face as Catholics pursuing lives of faith and reason in the modern world. Right off the bat, it's important to distinguish between two types of opposition we may encounter in this area. The first is the idea, often asserted as more or less obvious, that faith and reason are essentially opposed or incompatible. To believe something is to accept it uncritically, the argument goes, while to reason is to doubt until proof can be shown. Thus, to believe is not to reason, and to reason is not to believe. In the next section of this talk, I will discuss a number of considerations that can help us to see that faith and reason, taken in a broad sense, are not only not opposed to one another, but actually interdependent on one another. Although refuting this objection is important, however, I will argue that it is at most half the battle. For the fact is that there are many people who do embrace reason as they know it, and who also embrace faith as well, and also to the best of their understanding. But nonetheless, such people firmly believe that the content of what reason tells us, not only in the natural sciences, but also in modern theories of ethics, is incompatible with major claims of the Catholic faith. So there's a general objection, and then there's a more specific content-based objection. And I'm going to argue that they're both important, but I think the latter is more unique to the challenge that we're facing in society. There's very few people who renounce faith completely, but I think there's a lot of people who have a lot of problems with the content of faith, and they think that it's based on reason. So an effective response to this phenomenon requires us to diagnose the disorder so as to be able to identify and apply the proper remedy. And although there are many causes of our contemporary confusion, original sin being the primary culprit, and hence penance, the sacraments, and prayer being the most vital remedies, I will argue that there is another and more specific source of error operating in the modern world, namely the influence of modern philosophy. That's one thing that I study in political philosophy, which is my subfield of political science. And when I say modern philosophy, I'm not referring to philosophy that comes from recent times. It's not primarily a historical label. I'm referring to a certain type of philosophy that in truth has always existed, but historically began to dominate European thought in the beginning of the 16th and 17th centuries, under the influence of Niccolo Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, and others. From its beginnings, modern philosophy was designed to undermine many of the key insights of classical philosophy, which originated with the ancient Greeks, especially Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And the key point here is that the ancient Greeks, and all those influenced by them through the centuries, and that includes church fathers, for example, understand human reason in a way that makes it compatible, not only with faith in general, but with Christian revelation in particular. In fact, as Christians from St. Justin Martyr to John Paul II and Benedict XVI have emphasized, Socratic philosophy can be seen as a kind of precursor to or preparation for the gospel. And in fact, the Socratic form of reasoning remains a vital component of Christianity rightly understood. If we read the Catechism of the Catholic Church, for example, it's suffused with concepts that would be extremely familiar to somebody who studies Plato, Aristotle, and so forth. If we attempt to separate the two, they have argued, we end up with a reason that rejects faith, rationalism, or a faith that rejects reason, fideism, both of which are distortions of reality. The thing to recognize about modern Machiavellian philosophy, however, is that while claiming to be based on reason, modern philosophy actually presents a new account of reason, one that is not only in conflict with major elements of classical reason and Christian faith, but actually designed to make people hostile to them. So somebody like Machiavelli knows the synthesis of faith and reason in the Catholic Church, and he's rejecting both parts of that very deliberately. Insofar as people have come to accept this peculiarly modern view of reason, I will argue, it has made them increasingly hostile to the truths of both faith and reason, properly understood, estranging modern man from the traditional faith and in many cases outright divorcing him from it. So that's the divorce that I allude to in my title. And so if we wish to persuade modern man to listen to the church when she proclaims the indissolubility of a union of faith and reason, we must be prepared to confront the fallacies of modern reason and demonstrate the advantages of a fuller conception of reason, one that is not only compatible with our faith, but also superior in its own right. So the next section of my talk is harmony of faith and reason. This is the general harmony that I think we can see between these two gifts that we have. Let's begin the argument by considering what we mean by faith and reason. And for the most part, I'll be drawing from John Carlson's Philosophical Dictionary, which is cited in the handout. Soon we will consider an important controversy about the meaning, or rather the scope of reason. For now, we can simply say that almost anyone would agree that, to adapt Carlson, reason is the power by which human beings apprehend, organize, and affirm the truth of propositions about the world. That's actually a very broad and complicated set of things. Reason is not a simple matter. If we had time, we could delve into a lot of subcategories of reasoning. But to put it very simply, reason is the part of us that attempts to see and respond to the way things are. It's a primary tool that we have to confront reality. So what then is faith? Carlson gives us several overlapping definitions of faith. If we consider the first definition, firm adherence to a proposition in the absence of evidence necessary to remove all rational doubt, a possible tension between faith and reason is already suggested by the fact that the proposition we believe through faith cannot be proved to us beyond a reasonable doubt. On the other hand, it is also evident that, although it may sometimes be advisable to demand evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, as we do in criminal trials, it is by no means clear that it is reasonable or even possible to make this demand always and everywhere. And here I will quote Alexis de Tocqueville, whom we've heard a little bit about. He says, "There is in this world no philosopher so great that he does not believe a million things on the faith of others, and who does not assume many more truths than he establishes." And in saying that, Tocqueville was in fact laying the foundation for a critique of modern philosophy. But I won't delve into that, but that was his context. In other words, reason itself demands that we have faith in propositions, the truth of which we cannot independently confirm. If I cannot demonstrate the existence of subatomic particles or disease-carrying germs through my own reasoning, this does not make it unreasonable for me to believe in their existence. Yet, this still leaves us with a problem. Even if faith is necessary, and in certain cases we Christians call it a virtue, gullibility is still a danger. So the question becomes, if I rely on faith precisely because I cannot sufficiently investigate the matter with my own reason, how can I know that my belief is reasonable? To find the answer, we have to look at another dimension of faith. Here I turn for assistance to one of the most profound recent commentators on St. Thomas Aquinas, the 20th century philosopher Joseph Hebert. In his collection of essays on faith, hope, and love, Hebert remarks that the reasonableness of faith is determined as much or more by whom we believe as by what. So I may believe what someone tells me because of his expertise in an area, or because I know him to be truthful, or trust his judgment, as well as because what he's saying makes sense, and all these can be reasonable grounds for faith, despite my inability to prove beyond reasonable doubt the substance of what this person is telling me. On the other hand, if the person has not demonstrated knowledge of the subject, has proven untrustworthy in the past, is evidently prone to misjudgment, or says something unintelligible or contrary to realities I know it, I have ample grounds, and in some cases, even a definite responsibility, either to reject the proposition, or at least to reserve judgment for the time being. And here I'll quote from the epistles of St. Paul and St. Peter. St. Paul says, "Though we are an angel from heaven, preach a gospel to you besides that which we have preached to you by the revelation of Jesus Christ, let him be anathema." He also says, "Test all things, hold fast that which is good." And St. Peter says, "Be ready always with an answer to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you." So we see here that faith can and should be something that is reasonable. As these passages show, there remains one final step to bring us to the Christian virtue of faith, where, to cite Carlson again, we believe propositions that go beyond the reach of human reason on the basis of God's revealing them. That's the theological virtue of faith, to believe something that's beyond human reason because God has told us. Here we do more than acknowledge the limits of our own personal knowledge, so as to believe another human being who knows more than we do. Here we confront the limits of human nature itself, so as to believe something no human being as such can verify. Or as Pope Francis recently put it, our faith is not an abstract doctrine or philosophy, but a vital and full relationship with the person, Jesus Christ. Once again, we run into an objection. If something cannot be verified by the reason of any human being, how can we determine whether believing it is reasonable or unreasonable? Once again, the answer lies in knowledge of our own limits and of the credibility of the one we believe. Indeed, no matter how much we admire the heights of human greatness, whether it be the monumental works of Shakespeare, a Bach, an Aquinas, a Washington, an Einstein, or whether it be the collective accomplishments of architecture, engineering, computer electronics, or medicine, we cannot escape two realities. First, the world in which we live is intelligible. It responds to our attempts to understand it, and it rewards our efforts with theoretical and practical knowledge. And second, the same world contains mysteries that will always be beyond our grasp, the most fundamental of which include the questions of how an intelligible cosmos came to be at all, and how it came to include beings capable of understanding its order even to a limited degree. What do these experiences tell us? On the one hand, they tell us that the world is designed and governed by reason, and is therefore intelligible to us. On the other hand, we know that our reason is not capable of fully understanding, much less designing and governing the universe. The inevitable conclusion is that some other rational mind, infinitely more powerful than ours, designs and governs the order of things we investigate. Even without the benefit of faith, then, human beings can and have recognized that there must be a God, and that he must possess a reason far superior to our own. If such a God speaks to us, then, it is perfectly reasonable to believe what he says. So that's the general compatibility of faith and reason. Now let's look at the classical reason and biblical faith, the particular connections and harmonies that we see. So let's look at the specifics of classical philosophy and Christian revelation, examples of the stirring harmony that exists between them. Consider the familiar words at the beginning of St. John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Something of great significance to our topic emerges when we look at the original Greek text. An arche and a logos. The key word here is logos. This ancient Greek term, though it can refer to a word, is also commonly used to indicate the human faculty of, or specific performances of speech, argument, and reason. In the philosophical context, with which St. John and his early readers were deeply familiar, the primary meaning of logos is in fact reason. Hence, with good reason, we can translate the text as follows. In the beginning was divine reason, and this reason was with God, and this reason was God. All things were made by divine reason, and without him was made nothing that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and divine reason was made flesh and dwelt among us in the person of Jesus Christ. In other words, human reason itself tells us that there must be a divine mind behind all things and behind our ability to understand them, the light of men. And our faith tells us that this divine reason not only exists, but has spoken to us. And not only spoken, but taken flesh to dwell among us. Some scholars have held that the God of the classical philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, for example, is not and cannot be the biblical God. For the God of the philosophers, they say, is an impersonal being, a mind that merely orders the cosmos but takes no interest in human affairs, unlike the much more interactive God we see in Scripture. Now, in my experience, even if we stick to what the classical philosophers say about God, it's not really true that they speak of God in strictly impersonal terms. There are many counterexamples to that. But nor would it make any sense for them to do so, to insist upon the impersonality of God. For if we consider what is meant by the word person, we find that a person is nothing but a rational being. Any being possessing reason, then, is a personal being. So to speak of an impersonal divine mind ordering all things is sheer nonsense. And if we look at the Greek term logos, to possess reason is to possess speech. And so a God of reason must be a God who can speak. The classical philosophers understood that logos is what makes persons not only rational, but social and even political. By nature, persons think and act, and by nature, persons communicate and interact. As the ancient Roman philosopher Cicero saw, this means that all rational beings possess an intrinsic relationship to one another. Hence, each of us is part of a universal society that includes not only all other human beings, but God as well. And this society possesses a law, the law of reason itself, which Cicero called the natural law, and which hinges on the fundamental fact that a life in accordance with reason is intrinsically fulfilling and hence its own reward, while a life in conflict with reason is self-destructive and hence its own punishment. There is one more point to understand about Socratic reason, which will help us to see the problem of modern or Machiavellian reason. For the classical philosophers, among all the objects of human reason, all the aspects of reality we can try to understand, one stands out as the most important of all, what they call the good. To see what they mean by the good, we need only to consider a basic experience we have every time we make a conscious decision to act, to do or not to do one thing rather than another. Aristotle begins his classic treatise on ethics by noting that every action and choice seems to aim at some good, and hence it has been beautifully said that the good is that at which all things aim. As Aristotle goes on to note, there are of course many goods that we choose or decline to choose as we go about living our lives. But first of all, he wants us to see that as rational beings, we are constantly asking ourselves the question underlying the virtue of prudence, what to do. And the answer to this question, if we are acting reasonably, must always be some good. To say to myself, I want to do X because X is bad, or even I want to do X even though I realize that X is bad, is nonsense. From this, St. Thomas Aquinas derives the most basic formula of natural law, that good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. Now, if you were wondering what to do, and someone were to give you this advice, do good and avoid evil, you might be excused for getting a bit gruff with them. Do good? No kidding. Sounds obvious, non-helpful. The real question you're asking when you wonder what to do is not whether to do good, but rather what is the good thing to do in this situation. But this is precisely the point Aristotle and Aquinas are making. The question, what do we mean by good, might sound abstract and philosophical. But the fact is that every time we think about what to do, we are also, whether we realize it or not, using reason to ask ourselves what the good is. Now, I would like to give you a glimpse into the conclusions to which Aquinas comes on this question. Good, he tells us, is everything appetible or desirable. And thus, since every nature desires its own being and its own perfection, it must be said also that the being and the perfection of any being is good. Evil, on the other hand, is the absence of good. That is the destruction or perversion of any being. And it is also worth noting, as Joseph Pieper emphasizes, that the desire for the being and perfection of any being is the essence of what we call love. This means that to act in accordance with reason is always to act in accordance with love. Experientially, this begins with the love of ourselves, but since we are rational beings, our own being and perfection includes the recognition and affirmation of the good of other beings, especially other rational beings, including other human beings, and the being upon whom our being is dependent, God. So in other words, we're always, if we are reasoning properly, seeking the being and the perfection of ourselves and all other beings, especially other rational beings. Thus, Aquinas identifies three basic sets of goods that we must always act to promote and perfect, and never, at least never deliberately and directly, to destroy or distort. First, the preservation and health of bodily life. Second, the procreation and education of children. And third, the growth and perfection of our rational nature through knowing and loving our fellow human beings and God. As before, this account of what it means to be reasonable and to pursue the good does not depend on religious faith. We can deduce all these things by reasoning about our human condition, though it does closely correspond to the biblical account of the God who created the world out of love, who saw that it was good, and when it fell away from him towards evil, sent his own Son, divine reason itself, to lead us back to the path of perfection demanded by his reason and his love and ours. So my next section is on Machiavelli's challenge. And I'm just going to briefly look here. What exactly is the specific challenge made by Machiavelli and other modern philosophers to this view of reason? To see what happened to this account of reason in modern philosophy, let us consider two passages from the man who many take to be the founder of modern thought, Niccolò Machiavelli. First, Machiavelli tells us that it is a very natural and ordinary thing to desire to acquire. And always, when men do it who can, they will be praised or not blamed. But when they cannot and wish to do it anyway, here lies the error and the blame. So notice here that Machiavelli, what he's saying is similar to Aquinas in the sense that he looks at desire. But what he's done is where Aquinas sees that desire is properly for that which is good, our being and our perfection, which is an objective reality, Machiavelli says, no, there's no objective reality other than success or failure at acquiring what we desire. There's no other objective reality that's relevant to ethics or to choosing what we should do. In other words, if I want something and if I can get it, then there's no possible objection to going after it. Next, Machiavelli tells us that a man who wants to make a profession of good in all regards must come to ruin among so many who are not good. Hence, it is necessary to learn to be able not to be good. So he comes out and admits the thing that he is actually getting rid of here, which is the idea of good. Saying, well, the good is overrated. In fact, we have to learn to do without that. So as we have seen from a classical perspective, the idea of choosing not to be good is nonsense. It's irrational. And I think that it is, in fact, irrational. But to understand Machiavelli's point and the massive influence it has had on the development not only of philosophy, but also of political society and personal ethics in the modern era, we need to recognize that Machiavelli is implying something that later philosophers make explicit. In their view, there is no such thing as the good understood as an objective reality. In their conception of the world, there are only two realities to consider in acting: subjective desires and objective conditions that either satisfy or frustrate those desires. For them, the rational or enlightened person is not the one who pursues good and avoids evil, but rather the one who reasons carefully about what he wants and whether and how he can get it. How influential has Machiavelli been in the modern era? Well, few people like to be called Machiavellian or say or even think that it's okay to do evil per se. How many people today think about the good as an objective reality that can be known by reason? In fact, many people, though full of very good intentions, would be flattered if we call them pragmatic. But pragmatism, a modern school of philosophy, is defined as a philosophy that says that our actions ought to be governed not by higher principles, but simply by what works. In the absence of higher principles, such as the good, how can we tell what works, except by seeing whether it succeeds in satisfying our desires? Even those idealistic souls who look to satisfy the greatest good of the greatest number, in some cases are still following this Machiavellian premise. If they define the greatest good in terms of the greatest satisfaction of subjective desires. In this case, they are only extending private selfishness to collective selfishness, usually through some kind of social contract theory. And most social contract theories amount to some version of the idea that although in principle I have a right to do anything that satisfies my desires, in practice I will agree not to do certain things, things that frustrate other people's desires, on the condition that they agree not to do those things to me. Thomas Hobbes gives the most honest version of this, where he just says, by nature we have a right to do anything to anybody. But it doesn't work very well, it's not very practical, so therefore we agree to an artificial set of rules where we don't hurt each other. But he makes it very clear that that set of rules is not based on any intrinsic natural standards of right or wrong. It's only based on the practical requirements of not being killed myself. Not every philosopher is that upfront about that, but I think that really it either lurks as an implicit part of, or in some cases some philosophers are trying to get around that, but they have difficulty getting around that basis of things that's planted here by Machiavelli. So all these theories, what they do not require me to do is to recognize the intrinsic good of the being and perfection of any being, myself included. So what is the practical consequence of this modern idea of reason? There are many, many consequences of it, but looking at the medical field, for example, we can think of a few clear examples of this. If you look at the examples of abortion, assisted suicide, and the withdrawal of ordinary care, such as food and water, from those whose lives are deemed not worth living. All matters, of course, of controversy in the present day. From the classical perspective, such practices are contrary to reason because they destroy beings whose existence and perfection in this life and the next we naturally recognize as good and therefore choice-worthy. From the modern perspective, however, the only relevant questions about other people are whether they're helping us to satisfy our desires or whether they are parties to an agreement for mutual assistance or non-interference in the satisfaction of desires. When certain people have not yet become capable or are no longer capable of participating in such a contract, then, from the modern perspective, it's unreasonable to worry about their status as human beings and possessors of human dignity or goodness. Even to talk about that, I think some people, to a lot of people, it just sounds completely insubstantial and unreasonable. And I think modern philosophy can show us the perspective from which that it sounds like it's unreasonable. The same applies to my own existence when I find it is no longer desirable. In each of these cases, modern reason justifies doing whatever will best satisfy the subjective desires of those who are capable of helping or hindering one another in the satisfaction of such desires. And of course then I'll get to that in a moment, but anyone who argues that there's an objective problem with doing that, it doesn't sound reasonable. So my final section, my conclusion, is reaffirming the harmony of faith and reason today. In a recent address to Planned Parenthood, the nation's leading provider of abortions, performing about 330,000 per year, President Barack Obama vowed to do all he could to advance their cause, ending his speech with the words, "Thank you, Planned Parenthood. God bless you. God bless you." Whatever one thinks of the sincerity of the President's appeal to God in this context, one thing is clear. There are many today for whom his expression rings true. That is, there are many who oppose the Catholic teaching on faith and reason, not because they knowingly reject either faith or reason, but rather because their conceptions of faith and reason are influenced by a more or less conscious and a more or less severe Machiavellian conception of reason, according to which it is reasonable. What is reasonable is whatever helps us to satisfy our desires. On this account of reason, any God who opposes the satisfaction of our desires is unreasonable, and hence any faith which depicts God as opposing our desires must be a false religion. How can we respond to such people? To argue for the general harmony of faith and reason is important, but it's insufficient to the extent that we human beings are very capable, at least within our own imaginations, of remaking God in our own image and having faith in that God. So, on the other hand, any attempt to appeal to God in a way that sounds unreasonable is bound to appear as fideism or fanaticism rather than genuine faith. So instead, I would suggest that to the extent that modern man is misled in matters of faith because of his misunderstanding of reason itself, the Church is calling upon us to address this very problem by returning to the preliminaries of faith, to the insights of human reason available to us prior to divine revelation, but without which divine revelation cannot be seen and accepted as the message of divine reason to our reason. In other words, in ways appropriate to the varying circumstances of our lives, each of us is called upon to recognize and expose the flaws of modern philosophy to the extent that we encounter them, and to appreciate and promote the insights of that perennial philosophy rooted in the Socratic tradition of Logos. In this way, we can help our fellow human beings understand how these words of our Lord apply to the union of the divine gifts of faith and reason. What God has joined, let no man put asunder.
Thank you.